Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly O'Horo, and this is Adaptable, Behavior Explained. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Adaptable today. I'm Kelly O'Horo, and we're going to wrap up our season here, season 1 on our show, with some rapid fire questions. I have with me Taylor O'Horo, and she's got a list of questions for me from all of our previous episodes. And so I'm going to do my best to recap the questions that she has for me. So let's go for it.
All right. What is EFT therapy?
Emotion-focused couples therapy. It is therapy to help strengthen bonds in couples. It helps the client or the couple to identify their negative interaction cycle and ultimately address their attachment wounds that cause their conflicts.
Can you elaborate on attachment styles?
Attachment styles. This is how we relate to one another, and they fall into the categories of secure, avoidant, anxious, or disorganized.
What is the we concept in interdependent relationships?
In order to have a healthy relationship, we have to have an independent I and another independent I to make a healthy interdependent we. And interdependency is not the same as codependency. It's okay to rely on one another, but our okayness can't be dependent on if someone else is okay.
How does co-regulation work in relationships?
We are hardwired to actually be in connection with others. And so if, for example, as a parent, if my child is really upset, my stance of calmness and security can help co-regulate my child. And the same thing can happen in adult relationships, in our attachment figures, or even in our friendships.
How do you identify a negative interaction cycle in couples?
Well, there are reoccurring patterns that happen in a coupleship, and it depends on their emotional dysregulation, and those patterns tend to be similar, and they're usually based in someone's attachment history and, of course, their trauma history. And so we start to see something that's repetitive, and that's how we identify their cycle.
What are the common triggers in a negative interaction cycle?
Feeling like unmet needs, feeling unheard, unseen, lacking in affirmation or validation are oftentimes something that triggers us.
How does childhood trauma affect adult relationships?
Whew, how doesn't it? Well, basically, everything that we learned in our family systems ends up being part of how we see the world today. And so if I was neglected or unloved as a child, I oftentimes might project onto my partner that I'm being unloved or neglected now. And so that would show up. But ultimately, how we view ourselves, our safety, our worth, our power and control often show up from our unresolved stuff in our childhood.
What is the ACE study?
ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience Study. This is where 17,000 people were questioned by social workers, and they were asked 10 questions. And those questions indicated whether or not someone had a propensity for a future health issue. They were medical patients asked emotional questions about their childhood, and if they had a score of 1 to 10, and the higher the ACEs score, the lower the lifespan and the increase in illness and chronic disease.
How do adverse childhood experiences impact health?
Well, if I'm in fight, flight, or freeze too much of the time, and my cortisol levels are so high and my adrenal response is so high because of the things that happened to me in my childhood, and it's meant to be short-term and not prolonged, it starts to take its toll on our body, our organs, and then compromises our health, and oftentimes shows up like autoimmune issues or chronic pain, illness, and can even be more detrimental with illnesses, cardiovascular issues, gastroenterology issues, etc. So,
yikes. What are the 3 subtypes of ACEs?
We've got physical abuse. We've got household dysfunction, such as, my dad hits my mom, or I have, a parent in prison, or we've got physical abuse, just overt physical abuse.
How does physical abuse affect mental health?
Well, it definitely affects the way one feels safe in our body. And so if I'm hurt and physically damaged, especially by someone who's supposed to take care of me, like a caregiver, then it compromises my trust. It compromises my ability to see safety in the world, and oftentimes makes me vigilant or jumpy. And I don't feel safe in the now because I'm kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
What are the signs of emotional neglect?
Boy, those can be all kinds. I can be aggressive. I could numb out. I could be a caretaker and a people pleaser. I could really shut down and be super avoidant and not want to spend time connecting with others because I'm not safe to do so. So it can look like a lot of things.
How does substance abuse in the household affect children?
Oh, boy. Well, we learn what we live. And so if we see our parents coping with their pain points and their raw spots through substance use, then we learn that's how we should do it. And so, for better or worse, whether parents are doing the best they can, it still has an impact on our children.
What is the success rate of EFT therapy?
I think it's around 75 to around 80%, but it's pretty high. And that is if we go. So studies show that couples without a lot of trauma can make really good outcomes in 12 sessions. People that have a lot of trauma in their relationships and don't have their own individual therapists might need upwards of 20 sessions. But again, everybody's different, and that would be for more complex cases. But it's very effective. And it usually highlights the personal work that we have to do in our individual story.
How does EMDR therapy work?
Oh boy, it's the magic. Very simply put, if we have something bad, scary, helpless happen to us and we weren't prepared to handle it, our brain locks it in as if that's potentially something that could be happening still. And so what ends up, our body ends up acting as if the thing that was maladaptively encoded is current. And so we end up with past, present confusion. And so EMDR therapy, we go back to the things that happened to us and we review them using very specific protocol and help to catch up and connect up the thwarted parts of our story with today so that it matches the now. And anything that got stuck physically, emotionally, and tied with those beliefs of self, like I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, I'm not in control, I'm not safe, those get locked in with the way the memory is held. And so we help to review that and unlock it and turn it into something that just happened to us as opposed to feeling like it's happening today.
What are the symptoms of trauma?
Oh my gosh, there's such a huge list. You could have hypervigilance, nightmares, flashbacks, dissociation, emotional dysregulation, the inability to tolerate changes in environment. There's just a list goes on and on. Inflexibility, rigidity, etc.
How does trauma affect behavior?
Well, I think in the consequence of everything I just said, we might avoid relationships. We might avoid scenarios that remind us of something in the past. If I was in a bad car accident, I might be afraid to drive. If the car accident happened on this street, I might avoid going down that street. I might project onto all my offspring that they can't drive because driving is inherently going to get them in a bad accident. All these things might be an example of how we respond to trauma.
What is the window of tolerance?
Aha. The window of tolerance is a frame of reference that we talk about as trauma therapists where humans all have a certain amount of capacity, and that's where it's our optimal window of arousal. I can tolerate, think, feel, act, react, and use my prefrontal cortex. I can think and react in real time. When bad things happen, our window gets smaller, and so we might act more hyper aroused and be more anxious, irritable, defensive, hypervigilant, which might look more like anxiety, or we might have done that so long that we end up shutting down and we end up more outside of the window in the more depressed state or hypoarousal. And this looks like passive dead, shutting down, can't say no, dead inside rather. And that is more depressed looking. And so that's the window.
How do you build rapport with clients in therapy?
Listen. Have empathy, be validating. But I think that the key is not just doing those things, but doing it with exquisite attunement, really being in the present space with a person and allowing that felt sense of connection that oftentimes has never been there for someone. And so it's modeling appropriate attunement in a relationship so that they know what it's supposed to feel like when we are just really present with somebody.
Right. What is the importance of informed consent in therapy?
Just because someone comes into therapy doesn't mean that you have a client. You might have a customer, but you may not have a client. And when I say that, I mean, be careful what you wish for, because with EMDR therapy, which is what I do, it's going to change. And are you ready for that? And are you ready to uncover the reasons why you may behave the way that you do? And I want to make sure that you let your family system know there's likely going to be changes. And so informed consent is, do we have an agreement here? Because you came to me, and just because you're here doesn't mean you're truly ready to address the things that you need to address.
How do emotions influence behavior?
Emotions are the predecessor of all behavior. It's the chemical that goes first. It teaches us, seeking, feeling, loving, lusting, connecting, fear, all of those emotions, they indicate there's something that happens before our action. And so emotion affects all behavior. Everything we ever did predicated on the emotions that happened chemically in our body before we acted.
How does disordered eating relate to trauma?
Disordered eating is a symptom of trauma and oftentimes related to attachment issues and attachment injuries. It's a complex presentation because there's dopamine that comes from binge eating. There's a level of perception of control when I withhold food from myself, and it gives me this illusion that I'm somehow in charge of something. And so it's a complex presentation, but ultimately it's an adaptation that oftentimes is developed based on things that happened in our 0 to 3, 0 to 5 years, or sometimes even in utero. Once had a client who there was an in utero experience where they were deprived of food because there was a physical problem that wasn't passing nutrients from mom onto baby. And that turned into a binge eating disorder in her young childhood because there was an insatiableness, like she's going to starve. And it's because she started out starving. Mm-hmm. And so it's fascinating how what we don't think can it be attributed to our eating choices.
What are the signs of emotional overwhelm?
Boy, that can look very different. That can look like crying, tearfulness, anxiety. It can look like anger, rage. It can look like totally shutting down and the inability to speak. It can look like any of those things. How
does substance abuse relate to trauma?
It is a way that people will cope, and a lot of times people treat substance abuse as if it's the issue. But typically, it's a comorbid. We call it a comorbidity, where basically there's an unresolved traumatic experience or something going on in my life that I haven't resolved, and the way that I'm addressing the emotional overwhelm is through using a substance, and so it changes the way I feel temporarily. We call that a state change, and so if I'm overwhelmed from my day and I decide to have a glass of wine, I will have a state change that was chemically induced. And so oftentimes if I do that too much for too long or too many drinks every single night because I can't tolerate being in my current circumstance, then it can turn into an additional problem. And so they usually work hand in hand.
What are the common sleep issues related to trauma?
It can be the inability to get to sleep, to stay asleep, to stay relaxed in sleep. Nightmares can be impacted. Sleep apnea can be part of sleep disturbances. Sleep hygiene and things we do before we go to sleep can impact the way we sleep. And that can be, if I can't stop scrolling on my phone until the second I try to close my eyes, then my brain isn't going to be set up. But maybe I can't put my phone down because I can't tolerate the way I feel when I'm just being. So I scroll, and so now my sleep can be affected. So there's a whole bunch of things that the nervous system ultimately doesn't say it's time to be calm and relaxed and we're safe now. And so it stays busy, and the brain can stay busy.
How does shame affect mental health?
Oh boy. Shame is so hard. It's our most inhibitory emotion. It shuts us down. It takes the mistakes and the regret and the remorse that we may have had for something, and it turns it into an I'm bad. And it's really hard to deal with the I'm bad. It's like a big blanket of yuck. And so oftentimes that really negatively impacts someone's overall sense of worth. And when we have a sense of shame that's really heavy, we typically know there's some pretty complex trauma, developmental trauma, or something that happened over and over and over again for someone to have a big shame presentation.
What are the signs of hypervigilance?
That is a more obvious one. Someone who can't sit with their back to the door, someone who is constantly scanning when they're in a restaurant or in a place with a lot of people, someone who's constantly checking doors and locks and, buying replacement items before needed, having several backups for things because they're always looking ahead to when the other shoe is going to drop.
How does dissociation manifest in trauma survivors?
Dissociation is a trauma presentation that's fairly common, and PTSD is actually a dissociative disorder. And it's just a way that my brain will help me kind of take me out of the game and disconnect. And so it's fairly common, and most of us will have some degree of dissociation, although not pathological in nature. So I might be driving down the street and I miss the exit because I'm kind of zoned out, but I'm still present enough to swerve if a car comes into me. So I'm here, but not here, not like really paying attention. But a full like dissociative state might look like I don't even remember that I'm in the car and that I'm driving, or I didn't even remember gaps of time. And so there's 5 different dissociative disorders, and they can be pretty complex.
What is the role of psychoeducation in therapy?
Boy, I think that in all therapy, we have to learn why we act the way we act and what's going on around us. And no matter what type of therapy we do, we need to understand and learn the way the body works, the way we act in relationship to others. And so we need to be educated on all of those things. And so I think that any effective therapy is going to include some psychoeducation. And that's part of why we did this show, is we wanted to be able to help people understand how things work and how they work and why we might be acting certain ways, so that they can be more educated if they're interested.
Yeah. How do you explain the reason for history taking in therapy?
We have to understand the pieces of a person's puzzle, and how are they going to look at the lens of their life? How are they going to how were they impacted by, how they were parented, what their family system looked like? Where are they in the birth order? Were there resources? Were there religious components that may or may not have been helpful? Were there 2 parents at home? Were they treated unfairly? Was there any abuse involved? We have to know that, because that's going to really shape the way a person shows up and ultimately affects their presenting issues.
What are the common defensive behaviors in couples?
Boy, defensive behaviors might look like being argumentative, shutting down, stockpiling, stonewalling. There's all kinds of things that we do to be protected and on guard in our relationships, and none of which cultivate connection and help us to be in better intimacy.
How does the story we tell ourselves affect our reactions?
We all take the data that we experience and run it through our own filter, and we make up the story about what our emotional experience is. And I'll often tell people, feelings aren't facts. Just because you have an emotional experience doesn't mean there's accuracy to the why. And even though you want to look for the reason that justifies your emotional experience, oftentimes it's faulty. And, it is affected because our lenses are a little bit cloudy and our perspective is skewed because of our trauma histories. And so our story that we make up, or the assumptions that we make, really can cloud the way someone hears us, because oftentimes it's askew from the reality.
What is the role of alarm bells in a negative interaction cycle?
This says, here we go. We are going to enter our cycle. And in appropriate EFT therapy, it's not you that's the problem or you that's the problem. It's the cycle that's the problem. So when we see those alarm bells, we go, oh, the cycle is about to take over. And that's when we might have an opportunity to make a different choice and disengage from our cycle.
That's a good way to look at that. How do you cope with defensive behaviors?
Personally, it's a little bit different in my personal life. No, I'm just kidding. When I see that in a therapeutic setting, it's just data for me. It's like, oh, I just noticed that you're being defensive, and can you tell me what just happened? Now, being our best selves, that's how we want to approach it in our personal lives too. When we see that, like, hey, what just happened? Either what I said didn't land the way I meant for it to land, or can you tell me what just came up for you? Because I didn't expect that response from you. It wasn't what my conversation meant to elicit.
What is the impact of high cortisol levels on health?
A little bit like the ACEs question. Ultimately, we're not meant to be in that fight, freeze, or flee response all the time. And so it's meant to be in bursts, and then it's meant to settle. And so if we have like extended periods where we are in a lot of cortisol, it just wreaks havoc on our body and the rest of our systems. And it's just really, we're not meant to be in a stress state all the time. And so it hurts our organs, and it impacts the way our brain works and the way our computer functions for the rest of our body.
How does chronic stress affect the body?
it boosts our adrenal response and it boosts our cortisol response, and it makes us sick over time.
What are the common health issues related to ACEs?
Boy, you have substance abuse issues that oftentimes create other additional health issues. We've got pulmonary issues, diabetes. You can have, heart issues, cardiac issues, gastrointestinal issues. A lot of those are tied to adverse childhood experiences because of the exacerbated state of stress in the body when a lot of things that have been bad have happened to us and our body's trying to navigate that stress.
How does mental illness in the household affect children?
Boy, it sure creates codependency because our children are constantly sizing up our environment, and they're looking for what's going on and how do they need to respond to try to prevent the bad things from coming. And so if mom's always on the couch, depressed and shutting down, then I learn I have to take care of myself. I have to make my own food. I have to take care of my siblings because no one else is going to do it. Maybe I have someone who's highly perfectionistic and everything has to always be perfect. And that creates a bit of an eggshell. No matter what I do, it's not going to be good enough thing. If I have a parent who's really aggressive, then I'm not going to trust myself and I'm going to be waiting for them to yell. And so I'm not going to really try to do things because I'm going to be expecting it to be, yelled at or shamed. So ultimately, mental illness always impacts children, and it's why it's one of the scores on the adverse childhood experience marker.
What are the signs of domestic violence in a household?
Those can vary depending on the adaptation of the child. It can look like, low school grades. It can look like inability to connect and be in relationship with others. There might be physical signs of the violence, on whether it's bruising or black eyes or things like that, which are more obvious. You might see major expressions of emotionality, whether they're shut down or they're tearful, or there's all kinds of things that we can see that are maybe indications of domestic violence.
How does parental separation affect children?
Well, if parents are not together, the child oftentimes has to be in more than one household, and that can be really hard to navigate for a child. If a parent is estranged or alienated entirely, then there's going to be a tremendous amount of grief and loss in addition to the change in the environment. And it's always better if we can have two parents to rely on, for sure.
What are the common behaviors of avoidant attachment style?
Conflict avoidance, shutting down, not reaching out, not asking for help when you might need help, being incredibly independent and autonomous, and I've got it and I'll do it myself.
How does anxious attachment
As
style
you smirk.
How does anxious attachment style manifest in relationships?
It looks like, are you okay? Are you mad at me? They didn't call me back. They didn't text me back. Something must be wrong. Did I do something wrong? Am I in trouble? That's what anxious looks like.
What are the benefits of mindfulness in therapy?
We have to be connected to our body to know what's going on. Our body is the dashboard. And so if we are mindful, present, and I know there's a lot of buzz around that, but it really is the magic. If I'm in my body and I can sense what's happening, I can have choices about what I can do with it rather than impulsively reacting to what's happening in my environment. So mindfulness heals the brain, slows us down. Highly recommend.
How do you measure success in EFT therapy?
We get to terminate. Couples can repair. Their conflicts they're shorter. We can repair and move back and circle back. When we have empathic failures, we can address them, and we can get back on the same page and be back in connection.
What are the common challenges in implementing EFT therapy?
We've got to have two available partners that are willing to look at their part in things. We've got to have someone who's willing to face and tolerate their side of the street, and ultimately not everybody is. So just because someone comes into therapy doesn't mean they're both ready to look at their part of the cycle.
What are the benefits of co-regulation in relationships?
Boy, we always do better when we can rely on someone else. And it doesn't mean we have to have a big group of people. As long as we know that we've got someone we can lean on and have them be there for us when we are not doing so well, and we can say, I just need you to be here for me, we can move through emotional overwhelm so much easier if we can have someone to co-regulate with us.
How do you create a safe space for clients in therapy?
I just show up, show up with love, show up with compassion, empathy, understanding, patience, curiosity. I think all of those things are part of creating a relationship. And of course, if they're invested, and I think that something that's really important is to be genuine and authentic. They can feel it if you're not. And so I think it's important to creating a relationship that, they know they can sense a truth to who you really are as a person. And I try pretty hard to emulate that.
Awesome. We got through all of them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being here. Boy, that was a lot. So thank you. If you are interested in any of those topics at a deeper level, we've got an episode for you. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Hopefully that was a nice recap of season 1, and you found some of those topics interesting and helpful. And until we meet again, don't forget to lead with love. It'll never steer you wrong.